I'm going to invite us into this practice of um, maybe for some of us, it's trying it on. That's one of the East Bay Meditation Center um, agreements for multicultural interactions. That was the first one listed. And so trying on this topic of understanding and breaking down diet culture and how we can do so using the Four Noble Truths, and specifically the Eightfold Path, which is the fourth noble truth. And I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share that was inspired by this past Saturday's workshop that me and a dear colleague of mine named Marcela Raimundo, Raimondo. She's a queer woman of color who is a psychologist, and her specialty is eating disorders. And so we got together again. We offered Nourishing Freedom, it's called, 2 years ago, and then we offered it 2 days ago on Saturday, 3 days ago. And so this, I know some of you were there, and so I'm bringing the PowerPoint, and I spruced it up some for us tonight, and so I'm gonna share it, and I'm gonna read everything off the slides. So if you want to rest your eyes or anything, definitely feel free to do that. And so this first slide is the title, called The Eightfold Path of Nourishing Freedom. So practices in the kind of in practice of the middle way or the middle path. And this big aspiration of like body liberation, and to understand body liberation, we have to understand like what's incarcerating us. Yeah, what is stopping us from experiencing the fullness of our body. And the picture here is of about 10 stones, and they're in like a clear kind of still lake, but they're making little ripples, each of like 10 stones, and they're descending and getting smaller off in the distance. And the next slide is a picture of the Dharma wheel. In Sanskrit, the word is Dhamma chakra, and it's a picture of a stone wheel flanked by two deers on each side. And it was said that the Buddha's first sermon after awakening was given in a deer park, and it was about this topic of the Four Noble Truths. So a lot of monasteries in Asia, many of them, I understand, have this seal, I want to call it, on the roof of their monasteries. So this slide has the Four Noble Truths. And so this first noble truth, the word in Pali in the Buddhist language is dukkha. And so that translates as suffering. And this first noble truth, there's been a lot written about it, and there's different forms of suffering. Mainly, it just means that that suffering is like a part of life. Yeah. And we experience life through our bodies. Yeah. So I want to explore with us like how our bodies embody suffering, and the second noble truth really starts to point at like how it arises, how suffering arises, and basically how we make it worse, because the first noble truth teaches us that there's always an unsatisfactoriness. There isn't a sort of place or space that we won't experience discomfort or trauma or suffering, whatever, on the range of unsatisfactoriness that we experience as humans. And so the second noble truth, the teaching behind it, is that we start to experience the arising or the roots of the suffering. And in general, it's like a clinging, like we want things that inevitably change to not change, or we don't want to experience discomfort, so we do all these things to push it away. And in that struggle, in that clinging, it's like amplifying the suffering. And the third truth, so the Pali terms for the second truth is samudaya and arising, nirodha, which is cessation. So that's the third noble truth, that there actually, it is possible, and there are moments when there's a cessation, when there's like an end of suffering. That a lot of it is in the mind, this sort of this belief that something will never end, but that things do change, that things are changing all the time. And through our practices, we're able to experience the end of suffering, the cessation of suffering. And that we need to be aware of those, because then that gives us energy to practice this fourth truth of the middle way. And so that's Magga, which means, one of the translations is middle path or middle way. And in this fourth noble truth, it's broken down into the eightfold. So the original picture I shared with the stone, there were 8 spokes to it. So these 8 spokes are the eightfold noble path, sometimes called ennobling path or ennobling truths, because it's really challenging to practice it. At the same time, it is like our inclination, when we're balancing wisdom and compassion, that we're able to connect with these practices quite naturally. And so I'll read off the Eightfold Path, and in the next slides, I'm going to break down each one and relate it to diet culture, to food and body. And so the 8 are why, sometimes they're called wise or right or mature view. And I'm using the word wise. So wise intention, wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood, wise effort, wise mindfulness, and wise concentration. So before we go through each one of those, I'm going to define or use a definition by Christy Harrison, who's I stan. Christy Harrison, I think she's really really awesome. She wrote a book called Anti-Diet, and the subtitle is Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating. And she says, why obsessing over what you eat is bad for your health. And I first learned this term diet culture like 3 years ago, and it was really liberating for me to have like one term to describe why I was experiencing so much suffering, and in my choices of eating, and in the way I view my body. And so to break down this system of belief that is diet culture, there's 4 kind of tenets that Christy Harrison talks about. And one of them is worships thinness and equates that to like health or moral virtue. And yeah, the sort of the thin equals healthy, and the like fat equals unhealthy is like a lie. But that to realize that is like one of the ways white supremacy and patriarchy and its colonialism um, takes like control of our uh, autonomy and our like care for our bodies is by saying, hey, this type of body is like morally better. And so it's all almost all based in in Euro beauty standards and in colonialism and racism. And around this, that if we're not thin, then then we're actually broken, or we don't deserve health, or so there's a lot to each of these. Yeah. So the second one is so promoting weight loss as a means of attaining higher status. And so we know structurally that people that are in smaller bodies generally are treated interpersonally more nicely, but also structurally. There are structural ways that folks in larger bodies are treated with less status and even dehumanized and and not allowed to receive care in the medical system, and even interpersonally, even in families. Sometimes people are so critical. And then, so the third part of it is it demonizes certain ways of eating while elevating others. And so the big kind of red flag word for me is whenever I've stopped using healthy as like, oh, I'm eating healthy. And not to deny that like feeling good and placebo effect like are really, really helpful, but that's generally, it's just like not reliable across people. So it ends up blaming us people when we get sick. Yeah. And then it generally, diet culture says, oh, it's because you're not eating right, just buy this or eat that or take this supplement or do this new diet to like cure your illness. When in Buddhism, part of this first sermon that the Buddha taught was about like the heavenly messengers, they're called, that were subject to illness and were subject to old age, were subject to to this body dying, and then so this last one oppresses people who don't match up with its supposed picture of health. And this really relates to us as a queer Sangha, because it really points to this like extra, like disproportionate harm on like women and femme folks and trans folks and people in larger bodies and folks of color and folks with disabilities. Like it really targets us for not meeting the kind of filtered, again, Eurocentric beauty standards that are like, yeah, completely racist and unattainable for most people. So that's just an overview of diet culture, and I definitely encourage folks to look up Christy Harrison, or and there's other resources I'll offer at the end. So I'm going to go through the Eightfold Path. And so wise view is generally the first one on the path. It's this understanding that joy and suffering are intertwined. So it connects again to like the first noble truth, but understanding that there isn't like a way we can not experience one or the other, that they're interrelated. And so each of these slides is going to have two kind of rhetorical questions about how to kind of think of wise view. And so this first question is, how has diet culture taught us to be dissatisfied with our bodies? And how does that manifest as dukkha? So to be dissatisfied, so with our bodies, yeah. And how has this training like conditioned us to ignore like this inner guidance that we have that already seeks healing and seeks this middle way. So when we bring wise view to diet culture, we start to see like, oh, like this and that and this and that. These are the ways that we've been trained away from our natural inclination to heal. Yeah. And so Christy Harrison quote that really opened my mind to how we can, so I'll just read the quote, we can't permanently change our body size through food intake and exercise the way we've been told we can. And the same is true of our health, which of course is not dependent on our body size. So the second spoke, wise intention. So this is the resolution to resolving to practice non-harm. And so how can we practice honoring the signals from our body to reduce harm? So say with pain, like that we, a lot of the time, because pain is so compelling, we'll ignore the body, which is a way to deal with it, but but then we end up doing other things to kind of to try to avoid the pain, but ends up amplifying the pain. And but specifically about food and our body, that we, I think, have been taught a lot to not take comfort in nourishment in our body and in food, that it's been a way that we've been conditioned to think that certain food is harmful. So like, who taught us that? Who taught us that like, you know, I've done a lot of like family therapy with parents and kids, and a lot of the time folks use food as a way to like punish or to reward us, and that you could only get this certain quote unquote bad food if you're being good, you know. And so how, yeah, so these are kind of big questions, like how can we practice honoring the signals, and then who taught us like that certain food is harmful. Yeah. And there's an Audre Lorde quote that the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. So when we think of systemic oppression, like as teaching us that certain food is harmful, like, so blaming, so this has socioeconomic implications, right? So I grew up like with a single mom, and she was raising my brother and I, and food scarcity was real. Like there wasn't, there was food insecurity at times. And so then we get blamed for like only being able to afford certain foods because for different reasons, time and and availability and and location, like and that there was only certain access to certain food, and so we tend to feel like blamed for like not eating quote unquote like whole foods, right, or unprocessed foods, when actually the research shows that um, again, like I mentioned in this book, like obsessing over what we eat generally is way more harmful than what we actually eat, and it doesn't point to the what's called the social determinants of health, like the other aspects of what it requires to nourish our bodies. Yeah. um, so why speech? So practicing speech that is timely, honest, inspiring, necessary, and kind. So I put them in this order because it makes a cute acronym of think. So timely, honest, inspiring, necessary, and kind. And so what are the specific ways we've been taught and have internalized derisive and abusive speech about food and our bodies? So I word it this way because, again, our our mind, body, heart, and this inclination toward the middle way, that we're taught out of that. Yeah, so we are taught that our bodies are bad or not worthy of love, or or are that we yeah that they should look a certain way, right? And then the bullying most of us receive around the way our we carry our bodies, and when we don't fit the binaries, and so practicing wise speech, as I see it, is noticing and challenging and the internalized abusive speech. Yeah. And then what are practices that can help us communicate about food and bodies in loving ways? And so the metta practice that we did at the end of the meditation has been a main way that I've practiced this. And every time I eat, almost every time I have a blessing that may all beings be fed and nourished. And so that's one way, because growing up, I would get the message of like, think of the kids back home. For me, it was back in El Salvador that don't have food, or seeing the commercials with Sally Struthers and all that stuff. Like, and so to neutralize that and to feel that reality of abundance, and so that I'm communicating that as I'm enjoying my food and my body, um, have been some specific ways I've practiced wise speech. And I have a quote here from the Buddha from the Ekadama Suttas. I don't envision a single thing that, when unguarded, leads to such great harm as the mind. The mind, when unguarded, leads to great harm. And so this connects to the practice around the five or the six senses, so that we're guarding the mind and our senses. So in every moment we can see how there's a possibility of the cessation of the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, where we could see, oh, wow, like just drinking water, and there's all these great debunking podcasts that are out there, and one is called Decoder Ring, and they broke down like the kind of panic around hydration, and how it's always like following the money, and seeing how we've been taught that, oh, like there's a certain way, like, so as I drink this water now, I'm drinking it because my mouth is all dry and I'm here presenting, and nervous and stuff. And but then I get to appreciate it, and also notice the kind of fear that comes up around, the realities here in California of drought, or the and I get to be with what arises, and then I can communicate about it in loving ways, like that I that I wish for actually, my blessing for water is that, you go where you need to go, is my blessing for water. Yeah. So wise action. This one is refraining from killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. And it's not, in my understanding, it's not this moral thing. It just makes it really challenging to be with ourselves when we're um, yeah murderous, or stealing all the time, or misusing our sexual energy. And so the question here is, how do we reckon with the reality that most of our food systems are violent, right? And that many beings, including humans and the earth as a whole, are brutally exploited in order to bring us food. And so I pose this question in that a lot of the time I've noticed in my food choices that sometimes I take on the saviorism, this sort of individualistic way of of kind of fixing the food systems, when in actuality they're designed to exploit. Yeah, and how that practice of not taking on the displacement of corporate guilt, the corporate responsibility, um, and how to. And so this is a question, like, how do we reckon with that reality that we are, the systems as they are right now are, um, a lot of them, most of them are exploitative and extractive. And so the second question here is, how have we been taught that taking pleasure in food and in our bodies is wrong? So whenever I think of this, I go to Adrienne Maree Brown and this quote from one of her books, Pleasure Activism. I touch my own skin, and it tells me that before there was any harm, there was a miracle. So the next fold on the path, wise livelihood. So I'm defining this as working toward creating society where all beings are materially and spiritually nourished. So here's another kind of tough question: is it possible to make an ethically sound living in late stage capitalism? And I've really appreciated the term late stage capitalism. It sounds really academic, but it just reminds me that the system capitalism is not sustainable, right? And so it just reminds me that there is a need and a vision for those of us that are, which I think is most people, are like willing and open and to create liberatory movements. And of course we start with our bodies, right? We start with knowing that our bodies are connected to the world. Yeah. And the second question is, how do we practice wise action when seeking to sustain ourselves and our community? So Rabindranath Tagore, I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and saw that life was service. I acted, and behold, service was joy. So the service of that we're in this together, there is a separate self. Yeah. So a couple more. Wise effort. So endeavoring to cultivate skillful thoughts, words, deeds, and letting go of unskillful habits. And so we've hopefully by this point, we're starting to see how we've internalized diet culture rules, which both punish and reward us for how we eat and look. And then where do we strive too much to be perfect about eating and our bodies? And Prentice Hemphill, perfectionism is a commitment to habitual self-doubt. So wise effort is finding the middle path, and where I have fallen into unwise effort is like over exercising to try to permanently shrink my body, when that's not possible for most people. Or where have I like eaten just certain types of food and restricted and eliminated other types of food to try to perfect my eating. And when in actuality, so much stress goes into that. And then I'm not enjoying the food. And then I'm like criticizing my body because it's doing what it does, which is change and yeah, and do all the other amazing things it does. So why is mindfulness? So being aware of body, feelings, thoughts, and mental qualities. And how can we interrupt when bodies are being criticized by the unrealistic and racist beauty standards that are the foundation of diet culture? Sabrina Strings is an amazing author, Sabrina Strings, and she breaks down the whole history of the US and how diet culture is rooted in white supremacy. And how do we honor our experience and find wholesome ways to comfort and nourish as to heal this particular type of dukkha, these causes of suffering? Lama Radhawan. So mindfulness is training the mind to return to the present moment over and over again with a sense of non-judgmental awareness and kindness. So guided by this intention of reducing harm for ourselves and others. And then the last slide here, wise concentration, the last fold on the path, bringing together all the other parts of the Eightfold Path in order to connect with, see the obstacles and to serenity and insight, and and to find meditation practices that help us generate peace and understanding, insight and serenity. And so I'll leave us with this last question and then one more quote. What does freedom from the relentless messaging of diet culture look like, taste like, feel like? Sonia Renee Taylor. As we awaken to our indoctrinated body shame, we feel inspired to awaken others and to interrupt the systems that perpetuate body shame and oppression against all bodies. Okay, so thank you for your attention with that. And I see that we're 3 minutes before the time, and I want to shout out, like, there's an organization called fatrose.com, and they do awesome radical work. And there's so many other resources, but that's the one that I want to shout out. And I want to just keep the conversation going. We don't have the time for tonight, but it's definitely, this is bringing me a lot of life, this convo around diet culture and and breaking it down. And I it's, food is something we're doing we're with all the time, and so it's something, it's an engaged practice that we can do all the time. And so I'm definitely really jiving on this. And the teacher sangha, EBMC teacher sangha, I brought this in with Arisika and Deb Kerr, and we talked and related it to ableism and radical inclusivity. So just, that's a little behind the scenes. So it's really impacting the EBMC teacher sangha as well, so that we're using this as a lens to be radically inclusive, to include all parts of ourselves, and to have it be a path, a doorway to include all of us, especially us in queer bodies, and to queer. We're already queering so much to have those moments of being with our bodies. And then so this is another way that we can reclaim our health and our right to love our bodies just as we are. So okay, y'all. So I'm gonna bow to each of us and just thank us for showing up, and then I'm gonna dedicate the merit, so the energy that we were given to arrive here, the energy that came from food, yeah, both the nourishment of food and the nourishment of all the elements. And so giving thanks for everything that allowed us to come together tonight. And may the merit that we generated together tonight, may it be a benefit to all beings without exception, in all directions. May all beings connect to the nourishing freedom that is being so the longing for us to be free.